John Fairfax doesn't need us. He's famous, he's rich, he built Fairfax Iron.
He built this whole building.
Don't you think it's a bit grim someone's made this much money off the problem?
I deserve something for keeping the country safe at night.
Good evening and welcome to another episode of Haunting the Narrative. Today we're going to be talking about one of those things that you can't get away from in real life, the economy.
Yay.
And on tonight's episode we have
Mairead
and Meg
and myself, Natasha. So maths, I'm sure, is probably not everybody's favourite subject. But yeah, we've sat down and we've written out a whole episode on this. So
you're hearing it.
Yep. And it probably begs the question, why the hell should you even care?
Well, first of all, that's not what begs the question means, but we're going to save the
Is
linguistic.
It not?
No, it's not. That's it. But that's so common that everyone thinks that. So anyway, we'll discuss that another time. Sorry.
detour into linguistics.
Well, philosophy actually, but this must be an all-time record for derailing. Sorry.
Yeah,
Anyway.
Economy. Let's go.
The economy. Well, actually, I mean, Lockwood and Co. of all the series where it makes total sense to talk about the economy, it's one where the main character is a small business owner and a landlord. But also, I mean, Lucy is a career girl. Their rivals are rival companies. It's all very much about economics and business. So I think that's part of the reason why, you have people like us who are professional knowledge workers being so interested in this series, because it's so rare for what is nominally a YA series to like deal with workplace and career considerations that are just so much part of our daily lives in such a natural and convincing way. So
You know what? That is very much true, because in my previous fandom, which was Teenagers in Space, I just hit this point of fic writing where I wanted to talk about them like having mortgages and
Yeah.
jobs
and
and
you can
credit
do that
cards.
in Lockwood and Co. It just makes total sense.
Yes, 100%.
So I think, that's why I find it, like, I think if someone tried to talk to me about the economy in Lord of the Rings, I'd be like, shut up, that's not the point. But in Lockwood and Co, it really is actually part of the story. So really by digging into it, what we're asking is like, how does this world work? How do the people actually live? But also, I mean, it is very genuinely a motivating factor in the story. Although I'm gonna try and get myself cancelled right out the gate. I think all the people who say that capitalism is the real villain are wrong. But I just have to say something controversial like every 5 minutes or so, or I'll get hives. But yeah, that's it. That's why I think it's actually worth talking about. It's actually fun to talk about. And the books themselves talk about the economy quite a bit.
They really do. There's lots of little hints all over the books. So
And like really direct stuff as well.
yeah, I was going to say that there's a lot of really direct stuff. It sounds like you might have a bit of a list up your sleeve, Ray.
I do. I'm just bursting to get it out. Well, first of all, yeah. First of all, there's actually a quote from the Screaming Staircase that directly addresses this. It's when I think they go to visit Fairfax. And it says, hang on, it says, it was generally accepted that the problem afflicting the British Isles, so actually this is interesting, it says the British Isles, not just Britain or Great Britain, so that implies Ireland as well. It was generally accepted that the problem afflicting the British Isles was a bad thing for the economy. The dead returning to haunt the living, apparitions after dark, these things had consequences. Morale and productivity were low. No one wanted late shifts. In winter, businesses closed mid-afternoon, but some companies did flourish because they fulfilled a vital need. One of these was Fairfax Iron. And the show as well actually has all these newspaper headlines that mention things like, economic shock as pandemic spreads, which is like after COVID, it's like super, super familiar to us because it was a pretty similar phenomenon in many ways. It was actually a little bit spooky. Getting into Lockwood and Co. right after COVID was like, whoa, this is wild. But anyway, it was restricting people's movements. It was restricting international trade. It was creating uncertainty that made people reluctant to spend. So by the sounds of things, during the problem, you have all these, like all the service industries, hospitality and entertainment, retail, they're all curtailed by the problem. And again, that's very like the pandemic. On the other hand, manufacturing industries are doing really well, especially like lavender, iron, and silver. So that suggests also that British raw material extraction industries must also be booming in a way that they really aren't in real life. Um, uh, but of course, like the biggest economic change is that the ghost hunting industry itself is now a huge powerhouse of the British economy to the extent that Lucy, well, now, okay, correct me on this because you guys have dug into the data more than I have. Lucy, working 4 days a week at the age of 8, seems to earn more or similar to her mother, who's doing like 2 jobs 6 days a week.
At the age of 11, I think, when she got her grade 3 and the
Okay.
pay raise that came with it, that's when she was out earning her mum.
Okay, but still, that's wild. And it
Yeah.
actually it means that in problem Britain, the real commodity is talented children. So like it's kind of they're simultaneously empowered and exploited.
Yeah, and we see lots of other really interesting kind of hints to people's mindset about their finances and how they feel about the economy in the books. I always think about people like the armchair, what we call the armchair money ghost, at the beginning of The Hollow Boy, where, you know, the grandfather had stashed away all of his money and hoarded all of his cash in the chair. And that really strikes me as something that people do mostly only in situations of economic depressions. Maybe they don't trust banks as much. They just want to keep all their cash close at hand in case things go badly for them.
That seems to be an older person thing as well, I think, actually, because my granddad did that.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, like, you know, like Stroud frequently mentions the businesses that are doing well, like, you know, out of the
Hmm.
problem. And one thing that never comes up is bankers. So, I mean, I suppose maybe bankers are doing well in every situation, but like, um, yeah, I know it's interesting that he never mentions banks at all.
No.
I think probably bankers would be a little bit behind the times in problem Britain, actually, because they wouldn't have the internet.
Yeah. Well, I
Hmm.
mean, that is dependent on the question of whether the problem has spread throughout the world, like how the rest of the world has developed, and that's never really resolved in any
Yeah.
satisfactory
Right.
way. It's really hard to make sense of.
Now I was going to say, because that meant then makes you wonder about like, you know, people do have money. What kind of investments do they have, right? Are they investing overseas because those economies aren't affected by the problem? Because local investments would, I mean, the only thing that really domestically is doing well in Britain is all the ghost hunting industries. So if you're not invested in those things, you're not really going to be even making money off of those, which goes into banking and all that, and finance broadly speaking as well.
Well, I mean, with investing overseas as well, I don't think it's possible nowadays unless you have the internet. So if
Yeah,
the rest of the world has the internet and they're connected to the Swift banking network and all of this stuff, then Britain's just this little black hole, isn't it? Nothing can really come in, nothing can really go out.
yeah. Which would definitely you'd end up with a lot of like Britain, Britain kind of becoming almost like a third world country. Like you have like all the, or sorry, underdeveloped economy. Like you have all the developing nations around it, and then Britain, you know, you'd have to wonder would other countries step in to like prop it up or
I don't know. Or do they just like my personal little headcanon here is that they just kind of burn it off the map or stick a big black bit on it, a big cross, and like here be dragons,
I was
you know?
literally going to say that here be ghosts.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, what we do know about problem Britain is that there's a lot of poverty in it. I know Holly outright says that there's a lot of poverty going around the creeping shadow, doesn't she? But we can also see it easily. You know, Lucy's mum is working 2 jobs. You know, that his name's Tufnell, isn't it, in the Empty Grave, the carnival guy, the theatre worker. Yeah, so he full on slaps one of the girls working for him.
And it's not, no one thinks an eye
No
at
one
it.
bats an eyelid. Yeah, nobody bats an eye. He doesn't get arrested. She doesn't quit. It's just
I think
normal.
in the Whispering Skull, I always say the Screaming Skull. Well, I mean the Whispering Skull. Um, I think isn't it mentioned that like some guy horsewhipped one of like a couple of agents for breaking something in his house.
Oh yes,
Yes,
yes.
it's an insane stat when you consider that they're literal children. It's not even
And they
adults being
carry
treated this
swords as
way.
well. Like, what the hell? That's just not, yeah, all of that is just
So those are not people with unions.
These are
basically.
not people with unions. These are not people with workers' rights. I mean, like Flo goes on about how night watch is paid peanuts.
Mm.
And then you've got the 2 night watch people who went back to Winter Garden, which didn't turn out well for them. I say night watch people, they were like, what, 8?
Yeah, I think they were like 8 or 9, very young.
And all of this kind of, it makes you think that, well, number one, there's no labor laws involved, are there?
No, there can't be.
Yeah. And number two is there's not really a welfare safety net. There's no sort of welfare state. Which is kind of interesting when you look at, like, compare it to modern day Britain, like especially Lucy's mum. I've actually run the numbers with these. So a widowed woman in the north of England working minimum wage with 7 minor children would bring in a total of £3,600 a month after tax. That's £1,200 in wages and the rest in benefits, which is our word for what do you call it? Social security.
Mm.
And that's not really much for 8 people, but it would be enough for them to get by. Like, she wouldn't have to sell her kids, force them out to work at the age of 8 in the modern world. So obviously in problem Britain, none of this is going on. But since we have those numbers, you know, we can compare a little bit. So let's talk some real numbers. Are there any real numbers that they're given, that we're given in the text?
We have a bit. We have the fine for Hope House, like the burning of the Sheen Road house being £60,000. Lockwood gives a cabbie £50 in the Whispering Skull, and that must be a lot of money because he's willing to, like, you know, ram other cars and do insane stuff.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah, it must be. And then in episode 5 of the show, there was a notice in I've never seen this, but one of you guys has spotted
show
this.
and not book, yeah?
Yes, in the TV show.
The first 2 were book.
Yeah. And yeah, I don't know how much. I mean, to be fair, they put in so much effort into making the show, the details of the show match the book, that you would think that probably someone put a lot of thought into this. But anyway, there's a notice in a cafe for a bank cashier job, which is offering 7 grand a year full time. Then I think the only other number that we get in the show was Lucy telling Lockwood to give George £2 for a cup of coffee. Which honestly, like, it's a great price. I'd love to pay €2 for a cup of coffee, but it's supposed to be £2.50 if you translated it to with exchange rates or whatever. But oh my God, £2.50 for coffee! I'd be going there every day.
I would also be excited to pay $2 American or $2.50 American for a coffee. So
yeah.
See, but in the show, you probably wouldn't be excited to pay a whole £2 for a coffee.
I'd take ghosts for cheap coffee. Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah.
Yeah, you really probably wouldn't be excited for it. So the show giving us that £7,000 a year full time is this great little piece of data because, you know, historical wage data is a thing. So we can take that £7,000 a year if we're super nerdy and obsessive and go and check that up against historical wage data tables. And none of us are that super nerdy or obsessive, but of course I did it. And these wages line up with about 1985. So that £2 coffee that George is out to buy is probably rather fancy because at that
it's a little
time,
fart of a cup too, like it's tiny.
Yeah, well, at that time, a cup of coffee was 50p.
Right.
So he's paid 4 times the average amount for a tiny little espresso. So I hope there's some gold in there or something.
Yeah, little gold flake coffee. Really
He's
tried to
pocketed the extra.
well, the finest coffee. And we haven't even talked about, well, we'll talk more about imports later, but I was just going to say maybe it was who knows where it was imported from, but we'll get back
coffee's
to
got
that.
to be imported. It's got to be. But anyway, back to these numbers, okay? So the show, we can pinpoint the economy for the show is about 1985, okay? So we've already talked about this in a timeline episode, but the book is roughly 10 years before the show, which would mean the book economy is stuck at about 1975. Okay, so in 1975, your average wage was about £2,300 per year before tax, which works out to about £190 a month, again, before tax, which kind of explains the whole willing to commit murder for 50 quid bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, would you like a quarter of your monthly wage to drive around? Yeah, sure, why not? Yeah.
So Lockwood essentially offers him 500 quid.
God, yeah. He's offering a lot of money there, isn't he?
He really is. Wow.
He's very funny about money, isn't he? Like, he's, you know, sometimes he's like, oh, forgot my wallet. Can you pay Lucy? And then other times he's like, yeah, here's a 50.
He's squirreling it around him. I wonder if he's got like a bunch of cash stashed all over the house. Anyway.
Yeah, someone check his armchair.
Exactly.
He's got a
What's in
favorite
all
one,
those
doesn't
coat
he?
pockets? That's the real question.
Yes. Weapons, apparently, which is another thing I want to discuss.
Tea
Like,
bags. Tea
what
bags.
weapons is he smuggling in a coat pocket? Like, the only things that fit in coat pockets are shivs and grenades. So, I mean, both are in character. But
Yeah,
anyway,
both
sorry,
are
I'm
in
derailing.
character.
He also has lock picks, which I feel like people do not talk about enough. So,
Yeah, fair.
but anyway, back to these numbers.
Yeah. Back to these numbers, okay? £50, a hell of a lot of money. I
Mm,
did not chuck that in an inflation calculator, and I feel a bit silly for doing that now, but I did chuck that £60,000 fine into an inflation calculator.
right.
Okay. In the books, that £60,000 fine is a little bit over £455,000. Okay. The fine in the show verse is actually a lot less than that because it works out to about £181,000.
That's assuming that they're like 10 years ahead. So their
Yeah, assuming that
inflation
they're
is
10
like
years
10 years.
ahead. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
like, if they actually wanted to make it a fine that would be equivalent in size to the book fine, they should have gone with about 150k fine. But either way, it's a lot of zeros.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it would have sounded just so comically huge. Like, if you said 150,000, it's like how could you charge that for clearing a house? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the numbers we never really get in either the books or the show is how much a job costs. Like, how much do
Mm.
they actually bill for that? So it's really hard.
Doesn't Fairfax say he says that Fitz quoted him 90 grand for Coombe Carey, and Coombe Carey is an insane job. Like Coombe Carey is a like, you know, um look at your normal quote and double it type of job. So
I think it's more look at
presumably,
your normal quote and like triple it or
Yeah.
quadruple
yeah,
it.
so maybe 30k is like kind of a normal in showverse, like 30,000 might be a bit normal,
For a
which is
job as big as that, yeah. For like a big mansion.
I think that they definitely are like looking at their clients and the client's ability to pay as well, or at least Lockwood is.
Well, but I do also think it's telling that Lockwood, at least in the show, says they're mansion specialists because mansions have to be the thing that they can charge the most for. Like, there's a reason he's probably chosen to go try to market them along that path.
yeah. I do have to say I love the idea of Lockwood sitting down thinking, business model. Like it's just kind of hilarious to me. Um
Lockwood with a business plan is one of my favorite Lockwoods personally, so I'm all about it.
I mean, the funniest thing about that is that he probably wrote it when he was like 13.
we know you would love personal marketer, Meg.
Right.
Mm.
It was probably on the back of a napkin, but like I love the idea of imagining it.
Anyway, okay. Getting
Anyway,
getting getting back on track to our
getting
money.
back on track.
Following the money.
Following the money. Okay, right. So we have back to numbers. The book economy is stalling at about 1975. Yep. If we want to look at where the, I guess, contemporary book economy is at the time that Lucy's writing the books or that all of the events of the books are happening, we kind of want to like maybe compare it a bit with what's actually happened between 1975 and now in the real world Britain, right? That'll give us like an idea.
What happened and what didn't happen.
Exactly. So, because the 70s and the 80s were kind of important. So let's have a look at what was actually going on politically and socially when all of this went down.
Yeah, so to think about that, we really kind of actually have to go back a little bit further even to really talk about what's been happening in Britain since post war, by post war I mean post World War II. So there's a bunch of different things happening. So one of one of them is the former colonies are starting to declare independence. So that starts pretty much immediately after World War II, continues throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s, and even into the early 80s. But the bulk of it happens on the earlier side of that. So there's generally a lot of feelings about this in Britain, but um, and some people really do feel depressed about this loss of the empire. So we
I
don't know
kind of
exactly.
wonder if like a lot of the colonies weren't going, yes, get us the fuck out of this thing when the ghosts started popping up.
I mean, if I was living in a colony, I would be like, okay, we really need to break off now. I really do feel like it would have probably accelerated the timeline for independence from many people. Um, But kind of also in this post-war period, Britain really embraced socialism in a way that they hadn't in the past. So they nationalized a bunch of industries, created more regulations. They really focused on creating the modern day welfare state, which included increasing taxes and lots of other things. So the modern day welfare state in Britain was really implemented in line with what's called the Beveridge Report. It is
I'm learning
called,
so much.
I learned so much too for research for this episode. But the
That's not
Beveridge,
beverage as in a drink, yeah?
no, the guy's last name was Beveridge.
Okay.
Which, yeah, that was my first thought too. I'm like, why is this about beverages? But anyway, um, and basically the big argument of the Beveridge Report, which was written in the early 1940s, was that we're spending so much money on the war effort, let's transition that money to actually spend it to improve people's lives. So post-war, they implemented a bunch of acts that did a bunch of different things. So they established the NHS, the National Health Service, for any of my fellow Americans that might not know what that is. And then they established a bunch of Social Security programs, the benefits and pensions that Natasha was talking about, and just broadly established the social safety net as it exists today in Britain. So all of those things were already in place by the time that the problem started happening. The question is really what happened to them when the problem kicks in.
Depends on the fic I'm writing. Does it make sense for the NHS to exist in this? No? Well, then no.
I think it
Exactly.
does. I mean, the NHS would have already been in place a good, what? It came about 1940s, you said, so it would have been in there about 30 years-ish.
They defunded it to fund the ghost lamps so
I
that I
don't
don't
think
have to
so.
write a realistic, it's so that I don't have to write a realistic healthcare system ever.
Many,
Sorry.
many things are possible. And I mean, I think
Okay.
it's likely that my personal opinion is that other benefits would have gotten slashed before the NHS, but
Yeah,
Probably.
same.
it's just one of many things to consider. Other important things, I guess, that were going on before the problem kicked in were that labor unions had grown quite powerful, actually.
Mhm.
Um, and up until 1964, the Conservatives had been largely in power. But then Labor took over in 1964, and the late 60s were actually a time of relative prosperity for Britain. There's a lot of progressive reforms. And Britain joined the European Community, which was kind of an early precursor to the EU in 1973. So that might not have happened either, but that's kind of where everything was when the problem kicked
Hmm.
in and really started to become a big issue for Britain.
Yeah, looking at the timeline. So Lucy's talking about this is in the Screaming Staircase when she's going back on her little self-introduction. She says that ghostly sightings were cropping up in the 1950s, but about a decade later, so we're saying the 60s, there's a series of sudden outbreaks which attracted attention. My guess, like reading between the lines here, it seems that these outbreaks were kind of spaced apart. And then eventually Marissa and Tom come as saviors and figure out what sources are. And once they know what the sources are, the hauntings slowly spread across the country until it gets to the point that it can't really be ignored anymore. There are riots and demonstrations, and then Fitz and Rockwell launch their agencies. And then after that, the government finally steps in with the curfews, the ghost lamps, whatever measures they're implementing, right? Which I suppose would be when the war economy, the domestic production really ramps up to kind of meet the demand for iron, silver, all of that. So we did this timeline episode a couple of weeks ago. And from that timeline, I think we agreed that Marissa was probably born in the late 40s, which, the odd ghosts popping up in the 50s. This lines up. And then we've got from the 50s about another decade, that's the 60s. Then you've got the riots. It means the government probably stepped in around 1970. So that would be just before real life Britain joins the European community in 1973.
Mm.
So, looking at the numbers, the economy kind of grew extremely slowly from there because we've got contemporary problem Britain sitting at about the equivalent to 1975 Britain, which means it took 4 decades to get to that point. Whereas in real life, between 1970 and 1975, average earnings doubled. So that's 5 years compared to 4 decades.
Wow.
That's an incredibly striking stat to imagine, but in light of the depression we know that happened in the economy, I guess it's not surprising.
It does create a sense of like, you know, Britain being dead in more ways than one, because it's something that didn't strike me at all until actually I was listening to Meg say it about, the British Empire breaking up. And it's kind of like it's being kind of finalized almost around the time that the problem starts. And you have to wonder like whether that was deliberate, whether there's a sense of, I don't know, like it's just striking to me that you have suddenly death overtaking Britain around the time that the empire ends. That's very, very symbolic. Don't know if it was on purpose. Um,
I don't know. I mean, the British consciousness, we kind of feel like the empire ended in about 1950s.
which is when the first sighting started.
Yeah, that would be actually true. Yeah, when the first sightings kind of started. Commonwealth of Nations is still a good trade partner for Britain today. But actually we don't talk about it much in Britain. I personally didn't actually find out about it until I moved to Australia.
Yeah.
But getting back to Britain and timeline, talking
Mhm.
about real life Britain now. I'd mentioned earlier that during the 70s and 80s, quite a lot happened in modern Britain, which continues, well, not modern, but in real life Britain, which continues to shape modern Britain today, and that would be the winter of discontent. Now, in the book timeline, this would happen after the whole economy slowing, the whole shift to the wartime economy. So it's kind of worth talking about here because then we can really look at how this properly diverges. So, who knows about the winter of discontent?
Well, my in-depth reading of the first three paragraphs of the Wikipedia article 5 minutes before we started recording. But based on this in-depth research, I can tell you that it was a period of rising inflation in Britain, lots of strikes, the labor movement essentially kind of fragmenting and crumbling, and people losing faith in it, and basically like pure chaos on the streets, rubbish not being collected, all this kind of jazz. And it was a crisis that Labour at the time didn't really rise to. And I think Thatcher, by giving what appeared to be a strong response to it in a way, like as the in the opposition, is what convinced people to elect her.
Yeah. And so Margaret Thatcher was such kind of an important figure in modern day British politics that we wanted to talk a little bit more about her and if she would have potentially come to power in problem Britain. Because in real life, she came to power in 1979 when the Conservatives won their election. And some of her big things were embracing privatization and reducing the power of labor unions, which had a lot of impacts on Britain throughout the 80s. So, Natasha and I have some, I think, varying opinions on if she would have been elected, which I can honestly argue either side. But I actually think that given the completely like unstable environment of the problem on society, that it's possible that the Conservatives would have come to power even sooner. Because if Labor is in power when the problem breaks out, depending on how they do or do not handle that, people might want to change in government. And we know that labor laws are not strong in modern day problem in Britain, which kind of speaks to me that somebody with a Thatcher-like ideology might have been in power. And I mean, if
It's a
we
bit
look
of a
at
Tory wet dream, isn't it?
it really is. It really is. And I mean, just based on other British history from the past 100 years, like Britain really does seem has kind of a little bit of a liking for strong conservative leaders who value national security during wartime situations, which the problem is a type of war. I'm mostly really referring to Churchill there, but I think it's also true of Thatcher because in the real life, the Cold War is going on this time, and that was, so much of Thatcher's ethos. Um, and, in great times of uncertainty, people tend to vote for and follow someone who has a vision, which is something that Thatcher and the conservatives of that era were very good at doing. And I think I could see that being appealing when the world feels so uncertain, and especially the economy feels so uncertain.
See, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that I agree with that. Or perhaps not for like the reasons that happen in real life. Because as Margaret Thatcher came along in 1979. And I mean, during this period of time, like Marie said, it was absolute chaos. There were rolling power cuts. If you Google, just stick like Winter of Discontent into YouTube, and you will see lots of videos of police hitting people. So like if that's what you're into, that's your catchphrase. Anyway, the winter of discontent basically came around due to a lack of pay rises. The pay rises weren't granted because the government needed to control inflation. The Labour government needed to control inflation. Okay, they needed to control inflation because in 1967, same government had devalued the pound. Now they had needed to do that because they had to balance out deficits which were actually caused by the previous Conservative government. Okay. Now, in the problem universe, the devaluation probably happened because that was in 1967, and we don't think the government stepped in until 1970. Okay, but the devaluation took about 10 years to kind of like culminate in what led to the winter of discontent. And those 10 years in problem Britain looked incredibly different because it would have seen that shift into a wartime economy, which is always good for business. And this particular wartime economy, was a booming domestic demand for iron in particular, which all of the mines, because for iron you need what? You need limestone, you need coke, you need coal to power the furnaces. All the mines would have been booming off that. So, I think the miners' strikes, which essentially were the winter of discontent, the miners' strikes wouldn't have happened. And without those, I'm not sure if Thatcher would have gotten in. But like you say, at some point, somebody got in, and when, all of those rights that you had before, slash. Or perhaps they were just never granted to children.
That's possible. As far as labor is concerned. Labor rights for children. Maybe that was just some way to avoid that.
We can do this for a little bit of time. So you can see people saying, oh, well, we can allow child labor, or we can accept this endangerment of children, like it's only a very few and it's only for a little bit of time, and then it's like, well, it's only for just until like this current crisis is over, and you could just see it spiraling from there, and rights getting stripped back and stripped back, and people also like getting hardened to that, like people making compromises with themselves, and then starting to say to themselves, well, actually this was a good idea all along, because if there's one thing we're excellent at, it's justifying ourselves. And so you could see how even if rights had been granted, they might have been unpicked.
Back. I could see that.
To
we
go
do
back.
have some precedents. We do have some precedents, even in modern Britain, like younger workers are paid less.
Yes.
The minimum wage is lower for a 16-year-old than it is for a 21-year-old.
Same in Ireland.
I did not know that. I don't think that's the case here.
Really?
It goes up year by year. Same in Australia as well. I think I started work when I was 15, and every year you age, your wage goes up a little bit.
I mean, I think possibly the aim there is to make it not worth parents' while to take their kids out of school and make them start supporting the family. Like, I think that
makes sense.
That's probably, like, I don't actually know, but that's what I'm guessing is the aim with that kind of law. But again, in the problem economy, you've got a world where adults' ability to earn is restricted due to like their being curtailed by curfews. So you're kind of in a situation where, well, the children have to be the wage earners and they have to be taken out of school. There's kind of economically not much choice. I mean, there's always a choice, but again, you can very much see why people would convince themselves that that's necessary. And also, like, if you were asking me to walk into a house full of ghosts that might kill me for minimum wage, I'd be like, do you know what? Now the dole has sounded great.
Well, but that's if things like that exist. I mean,
That's true.
As we talked about
Starvation
earlier,
is sounding marvelous.
Yeah, I imagine that, social programs were like the first things to get cut. Like the benefits in the welfare
a lot
state.
of them didn't exist at that point in 1970 either. Like child benefit didn't come in until 77, and income support. Yeah, so if you were employed but you weren't making much, the extra top-ups that you get nowadays, that wasn't until the 80s.
Okay.
So they probably stepped back from what they had, but it might not have been as far as we're thinking it was.
Yeah. And again, you'd think as well that they would want to encourage people to have children actually, because children are a commodity in this world. So like, you know, you can kind of almost envision, like, those sort of keep calm and carry on posters they had in World War II, like,
But then, like, they're not as much of a commodity as we think because
no.
Lucy's an agent. Well, Lucy's an agent, so we always see everything about agencies and that whole industry. But she mentions there's only something like 200 agents in London.
I thought it was 300.
It's 200 or 300, but either way, like, yeah, it's a city of millions. You've only got 200 or 300 up and down the country. How many agencies did she say? She said there's like 100 agencies or 50. It's either 50 or 100 agencies altogether up and down the country.
Yeah, yeah, true. So maybe or maybe talented children are not as common as we think, because um certainly, like, I think it's easy to look at Lockwood and Co and be like, oh yeah, everyone's ultra talented like this, but we have to remember that they're meant to be really phenomenal talents. Particularly Lockwood and Lucy are supposed to be unusual in their level of giftedness. So yeah,
Yeah, I think
probably.
Lockwood like says because Stroud wrote that bit from Lockwood's point of view at some point, didn't he?
Mhm.
How
Yes.
did
Yeah,
he? Yeah, he either said now. This is just my weird memory, remembering the number two, but it was there's either two other agents in London who can see death blows, or there's 12.
I'm
There's
pretty sure it
12.
was
There we go.
12. I don't know why I have them. Yeah, 12 out of 300 is not a lot.
Well, and I mean, even just think about the fact Lucy's one of seven, right?
Hmm.
Mm,
And she's the only one who has enough talent for an agency. So just having a lot of kids in hopes that you could make money off them doesn't seem to actually be a good bargain to make,
no,
because that's not at all how it worked out for her family, at least.
no. Although I suppose if there's like, okay, if benefits are poor and you can't rely on a state pension, well then you kind of need to have, children as a safety net. Like um that is a possible reason. Um
For
yeah.
having kids. But then Lucy's family seems to be a little bit out of the norm, isn't she? Because nobody else really talks about siblings. Lockwood's one of two.
No, it's true. Yeah, but they're Southerners, aren't they? Yeah. Um,
I mean, I think it's true that for the average family at this point in time, most people aren't having that many kids because they're just barely scraping by economically. They can't afford to buy a lot of goods, probably. Their wages really aren't worth that much. So, and there's not a social safety net for them if they're not making very much money. So that contributes to them really having a very uncertain and unstable world.
It's probably looks a lot different to our world. Even taking out the ghosts, the whole economy, the way that the daily life is set up, it's very different. One thing that always kind of caught my attention, maybe let's say piqued my curiosity, is that they're all drinking tea. And of course, we don't actually grow tea in Britain. So where the hell is the tea coming from?
I mean, you could grow tea in Britain.
We could, but there's only one place doing it, and it's not very nice, and it's incredibly expensive. I did try it.
Mm. Well,
Yeah.
they tried that during World War II to
No, they talked about it, but then they decided that it wasn't worth doing it
yeah. Well, you still had India at the time.
at the time. Well, I mean, I'm sure India would still be happy to sell us tea, assuming that we're actually getting in imports,
Yeah.
which, begs the question, or doesn't beg the
No, it
question, since
doesn't.
apparently I'm using
It
that wrong.
raises the question. It raises the
It raises
question.
the question, is the problem international? Because
Yeah.
who wants to trade with Britain? Do you really want to come over here to offload your goods and then leave here if you might risk taking the problem back with you?
Yeah, well, I suppose the real question that this is kind of dancing around is the problem international? And I think, like, if we're doing Word of God, author says yes. Stroud has said at some point in an interview, I think, not in canon, that it makes most sense to him if the problem is international. And
I'm
Lucy
sorry, Mr.
Lucy
Stroud, but you're wrong. No, no, no. It makes zero sense if the problem is international.
I think it is hard to make sense of time-wise. Like, Lucy does say the problem had spread to all of our islands by the time that she was born. She says she was born in the fourth official decade of the problem. and that the problem had spread to all of our islands at this point, which you would assume means Northern Ireland as well, because she mentioned the British Isles earlier in that quote. So it has to be like the thing is, from what we know about how the problem spreads, it's like it seems to require a gate like being set up, which means like, you know, did someone from the Orpheus Society go specially to the Hebrides like to just set up a gate like on all these little middle of nowhere islands just so that no one would be suspicious? Like, you know, it's a little. We also know that hauntings spread in clusters, so maybe I think I have read sort of theories that people like a source could be activated
Yeah.
in one place, and then, you know, it might if brought to another place then kind of generate other hauntings.
Well, it's kind of like Coombe Carey sort of shows us that a strong haunting can kind of
Mhm.
activate weaker hauntings, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of
Right.
spreads out in ripples, right? So if you've got a strong haunting, then that kind of power emanates out in little ripples, and it will trip up some weaker hauntings. But if one of those happens to develop into a strong haunting, then that will then spread out a little bit more and, you know,
Yeah.
activate some more weaker hauntings, and it will kind of like spread that way. But then the problem is that ghosts can't cross running water.
That's exactly it.
So how is it getting to the islands?
It really sounds like it would have to be spread deliberately. Which I mean, maybe it was done as a kind of a cover our tracks sort of thing. Like, you know,
Right.
to so like if the problem is localized to the UK, then, you know, someone might get suspicious and go, oh, well, let's track it down to its source. But if if it's going everywhere, then, you know, if it's popping up without any apparent reason in Northern Ireland, and like in the various in Jersey and whatever, then it's then maybe that takes the heat off them a little bit, or maybe it's a hunger for power sort of thing. Maybe you know, if
I
Marissa
mean, it
has
doesn't
powerful
make
friends,
sense to me. That's
and
the thing, though, because
it's
Marissa was
the
like a nobody until the
yeah.
problem started, and then it would have taken her like a couple of years to set up the Orpheus and all of that. So I mean, at this point, we're probably looking at the 80s before Orpheus was properly set up,
Hmm.
right? And she's
Right.
got to kind of develop those contacts that she trusts to let them know what she's doing.
Hmm.
Because I mean, the only reason it's not highly illegal is that nobody thought of it, so there's no laws against it. Um,
Yeah.
Right.
but it is definitely some form of at least manslaughter, isn't it?
Oh, I mean, it's definitely illegal if you
Yeah,
find some law. I'm sure there's some law that you
I'm
could
sure
use.
there's something they can get them on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so that would take time, right? So she becomes a leader of industry, and through that position, she then meets other leaders of industry and slowly, you know, develops her contacts, her people that she can trust, and she pulls them into this society called the Orpheus Society, and they start working together to set up the gates and to set up the fences on the other side and to find the
Mm.
ectoplasm and all that stuff. But this all takes time, and it feels like by the time this is probably properly set up in the UK, it must be, you know, at least the 80s, maybe even early 90s. And at that point, the rest of the world must be kind of wary of letting people
Yeah.
from the UK into their countries, I'm sure.
Yeah. Now, I do think at the same time, there's always in a crisis, there's always like the helper syndrome, isn't there? There's always someone. I saw a lovely thing online recently, a poem about, I think, rescue services, and it was the quote was "Love is in the running towards" or something like that. But you could definitely see a lot, like, you know, Britain's not without allies. So like you could see countries still trying to reach out to help with this, because it's like a huge problem. And then there's also the concern of, well, if it happens in one country, why can't it happen in another? Um, and also, like, not to mention the fact that so many former colonies have people with relatives in England, like, you know,
Yeah.
Yeah,
uh,
exactly.
so like it's not like, you know, if Britain suddenly went off the map, then that's people's families gone, like, you know. So it's not. I do think that even though there would be reasons to cut Britain off, there would also be a lot of people who would still, for sentimental reasons, for strategic reasons, for financial reasons too, because um uh you've got things that I don't think Britain can generate itself. Like, I mean, does like I know the UK has iron reserves, but surely they must be getting silver like externally. And we know that Lockwood's buying rapiers and things from like Spain, France, and or is it Italy? Like certainly he's buying them from the continent. So there must be some level of international trade going on. But really, I can't imagine the problem having gotten much further, even if Marissa is working to extend it, like by the time. And like she's so power hungry that I think it makes sense that she would be trying to expand it. I just think that at the rate that she would be able to work at, that there's no way she could have gotten it worldwide within 50 years. Particularly given that she must have also had to slow down in the middle of it because there's this whole transition between Marissa to Margaret to Penelope. Like there's this period
Oh,
when
yeah.
Right, that would slow her down, trying to figure out how
yeah,
to, take over her daughter's body and all that
yeah,
stuff.
need to commit a little oh, what's the word for when you like kill your
A
child?
sedative.
I know
Oh, no.
matricide is killing your mother. What's the opposite other way around? Anyway, let's not go down that road.
Filicide, isn't it? I'm not sure. Anyway.
Filicide? Anyway, yeah. Um, committing murder in a big way. So yeah, she's to figure all that out. That must surely slow her down. So I just time-wise, it just doesn't make sense. But I think that was the theme of the timeline episode as well, wasn't it? It's just it doesn't make sense. Compels me though.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, there always are going to be countries who I'm thinking of, my own country, the United States, who are going to be still invested in Britain because
Mhm.
they're going to want to make sure that nothing like what the problem is happening there. They want to make sure, and there's also going
I
to
bet the
be,
evangelicals are having a field day with it.
yeah, seriously, but we'll save that for the religion episode.
I have so many thoughts. I'm biting my tongue with difficulty.
But I think the real thing is too, if other countries can still make money off of trade with Britain, they're still going to have the incentive to figure out ways to do that. And I know we've talked
Mm,
about a lot of different ways that that could be possible and how they could, arrange
Mm.
moving goods off ships and to keep things safe and all of that sort of thing.
I mean, the London docks in the books are still active, which is very interesting to me because I actually, in real life, I live in the London Docklands. So it's kind of close to home, and the London Docklands are completely empty. We don't get ships or anything in here. There are a lot of people in London, and like the London docks basically go from Tower Hill, which is quite far west of me. That's like 30 minutes west of me on the train, to another 20 minutes east of me.
mm.
So there's a lot of docklands and on both sides of the river as well. And the reason that all of these docks are empty is because in about was it 1980s? I think I did pull up the actual year, but I can't remember it now.
I think it's
In
the
the
80s from what you told us.
yeah, in the 1980s, container ships came into being, and they're too big for the docklands.
Mhm.
So they can't come up the river. These docklands are all empty because container ships can't come up the river. They're just too big. So we've got new docks that are now at the river mouth. But in Lockwood, London, they talk about the docks being active. They talk about dock workers. A lot of the people who died at
Mm.
Lavender Lodge, they were laborers working on the docks,
Yeah,
which
it's
means
true.
that these smaller ships are still being used. So either the entire world has kind of gone down, has come down with the affliction at the exact same time that, the UK did, which just doesn't make sense. I'm sorry, it's just not kind of physically possible. Or they're doing some kind of like, I mean, to me, it makes sense that they'd be doing kind of like offshore trade drops. The
Mm.
container ships are bringing it to maybe like an offshore island or something, or they're just bringing smaller ships up to an island and switching over to British ships,
Mm.
something
Yeah.
like that.
Or there's a worldwide Orpheus conspiracy that's been there since the 80s. And, Marissa actually has like a cult of very dedicated teens that spread out throughout the world. I don't know, I'm spitballing. But anyway, yeah, no, it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't make sense, compels me. And I think that's kind of the theme of like when you really start like cracking down into any part of anyone's world building, you're going to be like, oh, there's a lot that doesn't hang together here. But I don't think any writer is really setting out to create a 100% consistent world, or like, maybe occasionally they do, but those books tend to read like a Wikipedia article, and it's like, it's not actually why I read books,
Yeah.
No.
Like the most important thing is to convey an atmosphere or like a vibe, and Stroud is absolutely amazing at creating atmosphere. And I think like his big influences in writing Lockwood and Co. I know he's mentioned a couple of them, but we know that sorry English people, Arthur.
Did you say it differently to me?
I would say Arthur, like, I really like wrap my tongue around
Arthur.
that.
Yeah, I
Arthur,
like that Arthur.
Arthur. Yeah. His influences are Sherlock Holmes. Let's say that. Sherlock Holmes and other kind of like Victorian gentleman detective sort of genre. So it's the vibe that he wants to create, and he does it very effectively with this kind of more old-fashioned these more old-fashioned jobs, and like these more like the kind of just the lodging house, like that's a very old-fashioned vibe. It's not it's not an Airbnb.
I mean, even like the jelly deals and stuff that Lucy eats, like
Yeah,
those are actually really hard to find in London now.
When does she eat jelly deals? That's awful.
Oh, she mentions it at some point. She mentions it.
Yeah,
For people who don't know what
but
they are,
sounds
that's a
disgusting.
very, very old London delicacy,
Yeah, no, it is like I definitely remember reading about that in like, in books that are set in like Victorian London. So I mean, that's just the vibe he wants to create. And also the whole child labor thing, that's very Victorian London. So
Chucking the
but
chimney sweeps up the chimney, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's just not possible, like I said, to create a world that's 100% internally consistent. So to me, in a way, it's far more important for the world to feel immersive and real. And I think the fact that 4 grown women are staying up late on a Sunday night, even though we all have jobs, well, sorry, 3 because we're missing Lizzie tonight, but we're staying up late on a Sunday night to like chat about this is like proof that that he's been effective. He's created a world that really feels real and that you care about. So even if you are like, but the timeline doesn't make sense, it's still it's it's effective.
It is. You're absolutely right with that.
And with that, that sounds like a great way to wrap this episode up. That's all we have for you tonight. So you can find us a variety of places on the internet. You can email us at hauntingthenarrativepodcast@gmail.com. You can also visit our website at hauntingthenarrative.wixsite.com/podcast. You can find us on X at HTN Podcast and on Tumblr at Haunting the Narrative Pod. So we look forward to hearing from you. Please send us your questions, comments. Do you have further thoughts about Margaret Thatcher? We would love to hear them.
Do you want to know what begging the question actually means? I would love to tell you at great length. I will give you my personal phone number. No, I'm kidding.
Please do send in some questions though, because we're kind of planning to put together like a little grab bag episode. So if we get enough questions, you might get an episode that's just that.
Exactly.
Well, that's it for tonight, and thank you all so much.
Thanks for listening. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.